In the words of Agatha Christie, I specialise in murders of quiet domestic interest. And that's what we're going to be talking about now, a domestic murder. Hi, my name's Nick, and welcome to the second edition of my online virtual tours. In this case, I'm recreating my murder tour of Brighton. And in order to show you around the city effectively in these times of lockdown, we need to employ certain technologies. So here we are in Brighton, and we've just been talking about a murderous hangman, the hangman of Hove, that lived at Montpellier Road, just on our left here. But now we're going to venture deeper into the city to find our next crime passionnel. So let's go. So here we are on Western Road. Now these images all come from a large internet service provider, as I've said before, and this is how we can show you virtually around the city. And as we go down the main thoroughfare, Western Road, we come onto a road called Preston Street, affectionately known by people who live here as Food Street, because of the proliferation of restaurants and cafes that runs along its length, many of which I can personally recommend. And as we go down Preston Street, heading, as you can see, for the beach and the sea, we're going to come out onto King's Road. King's Road is the main seafront road. There's the West Pier gently falling to pieces in the distance there. And here, of course, is the I-360, or the Eyesore 360, as many local residents refer to it. One of the greatest crimes against Brighton. And near the I-360 is this rather stunningly ugly piece of architecture. This is the Holiday Inn, built in the 1970s. And it's not terribly prepossessing, but it's where our story starts. Because on the site of this Holiday Inn, there used to be a very different establishment. And it's here that our second crime begins. So before the Holiday Inn reared its ugly head, there was another hotel based in the same spot. It was called the Bedford Hotel, and it was very prestigious. Many famous authors, artists, and writers stayed there. It survived up until the 1980s, when unfortunately it was destroyed by fire. One of the people that stayed there was Charles Dickens, while he was in Brighton, writing a novel called Barnaby Rudge. But around the corner from the Bedford Hotel, a little square called Cavendish Place, one of the many small Georgian squares that are dotted around the city. And in one of these well-appointed apartments, there lived a doctor in the 1860s, a respectable Victorian doctor. It's worse than that. He's dead, Jim. Sorry, that's not the doctor I was thinking of. Let's see if we can find a better one. There he is. This is Dr. Alfred Warder. And in April of 1866, Dr. Warder moved into Cavendish Place with his wife, Helen. But unfortunately, all was not well in the Warder household. Helen Warder was unwell. She'd been unwell for some time. She'd been confined to her house for many weeks. I think we can all understand how that feels. Luckily, of course, Helen Warder had support from her caring husband, the good doctor, and Dr. Warder was keen to prescribe a course of treatment that would help her to get better. And the treatment that he prescribed was one which was well known at the time. The medication he prescribed was called aconite. Aconite, as you can see by the label, was in fact a poison, but taken in very small quantities, it had a healing effect. Aconite had been used in this way since Victorian times, but hundreds of years before, it had a very different reputation and a different name. It was called wolfsbane, and it had been used as a very effective poison. So this was what Dr. Warder prescribed for his good lady wife. But unfortunately, the treatment didn't seem to be working. Helen Warder's condition continued to deteriorate all through April of that year. But her husband wasn't the only medical one in the family. Helen Warder had a brother, Mr. Bramwell, who'd been an army surgeon. And Mr. Bramwell was increasingly concerned with his sister's condition. He came to visit her frequently, and on one occasion he'd become so exasperated by her failure to recuperate that he demanded a second opinion. He invited a doctor called Dr. Taff to attend his sister. Dr. Taff made a thorough examination and came up with a new course of treatment which he was sure would work and would help her to recover. Dr. Taff's recommendation seemed to go to the other end of the spectrum. He said, ditch the aconite, and instead, I recommend a course of opium. So now we have a deadly poison on one hand and an hallucinogenic drug on the other. I know which one I'd probably choose. Opium was, of course, widely available at the time. It was legal. It was used in various ways. One of them was a tincture of opium called laudanum, and it was often employed by young ladies in distress. When their corsets were too tight, for example, which was most of the time, they would simply have a handkerchief that was dipped in this ointment, this tincture of opium, and that would make them feel better for a time. But unfortunately, this new course of treatment didn't seem to be working either, despite her husband's ministrations. Helen Warder's condition became worse and worse, and she was eventually confined to her bed. Mr. Bramwell, her brother, became increasingly concerned and visited on many occasions. At the beginning of June, he came to visit his sister, and he found only the maid who answered the door. The maid said that her master, the doctor, had gone away for the day. Mr. Bramwell climbed the stairs and knocked at his sister's door, but there was no response. After a few moments, he entered and saw the body of his sister there on the bed. Mr. Bramwell and Dr. Taff both had huge concerns about the cause of death, and they demanded an immediate inquest. And at the inquest, the coroner uncovered something rather disturbing. Helen Warder's liver contained huge amounts of aconite, over 30 times the required palliative dose, and this was clearly what had killed her. The police obviously were extremely keen to talk to Dr. Warder, but apparently, upon learning the news of his wife's death, Dr. Warder had gone to London, inconsolable with grief. But that wasn't true. Dr. Warder had spent a day in London, but then he'd returned secretly, and he'd booked himself in to the Bedford Hotel, just around the corner from where he lived. The next morning, the chambermaid, on entering his room, found his corpse, with a bottle of prussic acid next to it, which he had apparently drunk in its entirety. Of course, a full inquest did take place, and a court case. And at the court case, Dr. Alfred Warder was found posthumously guilty of the murder of his wife. But during the trial itself, some other facts came to light. It turns out that Dr. Warder had been married before. Not just once, but 3 times. And that all of his wives died suddenly. in mysterious circumstances. Dr. Warder's body was taken to St. Nicholas's Church, the oldest church in Brighton. But because he was a convicted murderer, the tradition of the time was that his body wasn't buried in hallowed ground. He was buried instead in a plain, unmarked grave in common ground outside the cemetery. So that's the story of Dr. Warder, the Bluebeard of Brighton.